So Ray, in HASS2000 we have some course concepts to describe the building blocks of new knowledge, and I'm going to ask you now about your work in relation to those concepts. So first, talking about data and sources, in your research you draw on a range of different materials. Could you talk about your sources, please?
Well, I think the one that, or the source material that's probably easy to communicate about at this stage would be the sound files. Now, these recordings were made during the 60s and 70s by a number of linguists and anthropologists in the field, capturing language material, but also capturing stories about country and various other things. So there's a great deal of material available. Lots of this material is housed at the IATSIS in Canberra, the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, big long word. Lots of material there. The great tragedy, though, that not many Aboriginal people, not many Gurri are actually working with those sound files. Our consumption of that material usually comes via a linguist or other researchers describing what those sound files are. So those are the primary, that's one of the primary sources that I use, and I consider them primary because of my ability to understand the nuances in the language. And the language I talk about is not just the traditional language, because I didn't have a broad sense of that language, but I understood the language called crossover language, which is what I call crossover language. That means that I understand when people are elaborating in a conversation or withdrawing in a conversation, or perhaps even going, yeah, well, okay, that'll do, meaning that the transmission hasn't yet passed. Can I give you one little example? An old man talking about travelling to Kempsey on his horse, for a big event. He says, he said, I went away into Kempsey. Gaza Manan, he said he went away on his horse. Gimbisigu show na nigray. So at the showground, he saw a lot of his own kind. So he saw a lot of his own people there at the Kempsey. Now, I can articulate this sound because I've been practicing the sounds. But he talks about seeing somebody there. He said, "Ngai gori nyal nyutu," and I know the word nyal, ngai, nyal, see, gori, Aboriginal person, nyutu is face. And then he giggles, he goes, and I knew immediately he was talking about a woman. His next words are, pretty nyal nyutu, somebody with a pretty face. So that's what I talk about. That's the skill that I believe that people of my generation still have, the ability to interpret the material, not so much about the detail, but about how people are expressing themselves in that crossover language.
So can I ask you about that in a way that moves from speaking as a linguist, approaching those sound recordings, so hearing the words and the sounds, and perhaps then writing them down and attaching meanings to them. So you can tell as I'm asking you that question that I'm not a linguist, but if we're going to unpack what it is that you do around taking those sources and then making meaning from them, is that what you do? Do you sit there and have a set of headphones on and listening to this wonderful story just told, based at Kempsey? So just take us through that. I know it sounds a little unusual that I would say, talk about what you would do in a day in your research, but this is really helpful to know.
Well, in the first instance, all I did was transcribe. I went through the material and just wrote longhand, without any great detail, rough shapes of sounds, and so I'd segment questions from answers, and then I would interpret from the material about whether the question was being re-asked or whether there was a variation to that. but just longhand writing, and just phonetic sounds to start with. Things in somewhere in the soundscape, and that happened in periods. But over the years, what I've then begun to do is to go back with each of those transcriptions and work at the very, very depth of the language. And that means to take a single word and to listen to it at the front, listen to it at the back, and go, yes. So what began to change in my mind were these soundscapes. Now what I'm doing all the way along is articulating in sound. So if I hear a sound, then I describe that at the moment with a double R, only because I haven't yet found a better formula. But if the first part is nga, ari, then I can work this thing out. But it took me a long time for these things to begin to start to happen. But in truth, when the stories began to really make sense, when I was asleep. When I would dream, I would actually dream in this language, because I'd been consuming so much, or I'd been, connecting to this language on so much material, as a research area. But what began to happen is theory began to happen in my dreams, and I'd wake up in the morning, I'd go, I'll bet you that's there, and I would go back to the source, and it would be there. And I'd go, okay, so the next thing, if it's there, then it's likely to be connected to this word. And that's how I began to then correlate the material. And then I could say, okay, so the sounds are the same. So, but, we talk about the mouth being a toolbox, the ingredient. Grandfather would say to us, "What's wrong with you, kid? Your tongue going like leather." What he was saying was that we didn't have the trill. We couldn't move the trill. So I'd drive along in the car and I'd make out that I was singing and had music on, and all the time I'm going, singing, but all the time making this tongue work. And so, lo and behold, this theory developed. So the method was to listen. The second bit was to try and enact the sounds. And then what began to move forward was this melody of language. So if I sang ngaya, gimbisukumanai, I then begin to be able to listen to the sequence of words. So then you have to have this, it comes as a consequence of this daily listening, but also being able to understand that each of those little bits are important. So the very small bits, means there. And so people go, So I remember as a kid, if we're sitting down and the old people wanted for us to go to bed or to be quiet, or, they go, go on, hear that? Now we knew that they were talking about something that wasn't here, but something that we should be mindful of. So, and so when they would put we just thought, okay, something's there. But we also knew that they were talking about something there. And now today I realise that there's a trill on the end of it. So there's a trill with a following vowel of E, which means this, that, there. So ari means that, there. Didn't know this at the time, but as soon as it began to happen, as soon as the language material began to happen, I began to immediately think about the way in which the old people were communicating to us as kids. And I went, we use that.